Novak Djokovic has 24 Grand Slam titles, a record that may never be matched. He reached the Australian Open final in January 2026, his first Slam final in 18 months, and came within 4 sets of becoming the first player in history, man or woman, to win 25 majors. He would eventually lose to Carlos Alcaraz. And then, in the post-match press conference, he said something that Boris Becker, one of the greatest players in the history of the sport, walked away from believing was the closest thing to a public admission that the chase for a 25th Grand Slam may already be over. Neither because of Alcaraz nor Sinner. It is because of something else, which has been sitting in plain sight for over a year, and that the conversation around Djokovic has been dancing around without quite landing on it. The word Djokovic himself used was physicality, nothing to do with tactics, matchups, or the quality of his opponents. He told the press after Melbourne that the challenge of defeating both Sinner and Alcaraz in consecutive best-of-5 matches at a Grand Slam was a problem he was genuinely uncertain he could solve. Not because they are better tennis players than him on any given point, but because the physical demand of beating them back-to-back over 5 sets at the age of 38 has become something that sits at or beyond the edge of what his body can reliably deliver. Best of 3, he said, was a different conversation. He still believed in himself over 3 sets. But best of 5, repeated, across a fortnight in the desert heat of Melbourne, or on the clay of Roland Garros, or the grass of Wimbledon. He was not hiding from the question. He was answering it honestly, and the answer was that it was very difficult. Think about what it actually takes to win a Grand Slam at the age of 38. You need to win 7 matches, all best of 5, over 14 days, against players who are, in many cases, 15 or 20 years younger than you, at the physical peak of their athletic lives. You need to recover from each match within 48 hours, a window that shrinks in its effectiveness with every passing year of a professional career. You need to manage your body, your sleep, your nutrition, your nervous system, and your mental state across 2 full weeks of competition while simultaneously preparing for the next match. Djokovic has done all of this at an extraordinary level for his entire career. But the specificity of what he said after Melbourne, distinguishing between best of 3 and best of 5, as if they were fundamentally different competitive environments, reveals something that the statistics alone don't capture. The 3-set format is a sprint. The 5-set format is a marathon. And the physical cost of running back-to-back marathons at 38 against the 2 best players on the planet is the real obstacle. Boris Becker, commenting on that specific press conference appearance, said he believed Djokovic had indirectly admitted that winning another Grand Slam was no longer a realistic objective, and crucially, that the honest reason was his age combined with the physical demands of the format. Not the identity of the opponents, not any specific weakness in his game. The format. Best of 5, repeated, at 38 years old. Becker has played enough tennis at the highest level to understand exactly what that statement means, and he is not someone who reaches for dramatic conclusions lightly. His reading of what Djokovic said in Melbourne was that it was a man of extraordinary intelligence and self-awareness, describing his situation with complete accuracy. This is the detail that keeps getting buried. Every conversation about whether Djokovic can win a 25th Grand Slam gravitates immediately to Alcaraz and Sinner, as if those 2 players are the problem, as if removing them from the equation would make the path clear. But Djokovic himself never framed it that way. He acknowledged that Alcaraz and Sinner are the obstacles he would need to overcome in the latter stages of a major, yes. But the reason he cannot reliably overcome them is not because they have found a tactical answer to his game. It is because getting to them, winning 4 or 5 rounds of best-of-5 tennis across 2 weeks at 38 years old, requires a physical output that his body is no longer guaranteed to deliver at the level required. The opponent is almost secondary. Yevgeny Kafelnikov, The two-time Grand Slam champion, who has spoken repeatedly and candidly about Djokovic's situation throughout the past year, put the physical argument in a different context, but arrived at the same place. He observed that the Athens Hellenic Championship, where Djokovic won his 101st career title in late 2025 by playing 4 matches, was, despite being a considerably lower-tier event than any Grand Slam, an enormous physical burden at Djokovic's age. Playing against a 22-year-old Lorenzo Musetti, who is at the absolute peak of his physical capabilities, was not simple even at that level. Kafelnikov's point was not to diminish what Djokovic achieved there. Winning a title at any level at 38 is remarkable, but to make visible the cost that even relatively modest competitive efforts now carry for a body that has been pushed to its absolute limits for 20-plus years on tour. If 4 matches in Athens is an enormous burden, 13 matches at Roland Garros on clay is something else entirely. Kafelnikov went further, suggesting that Djokovic's real goal in the final chapter of his career may have already shifted away from Grand Slam titles entirely. The career record for most ATP titles in history belongs to Jimmy Connors, who won 109. Djokovic is currently sitting on 101, 8 behind Connors, with a targeted retirement at the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics, giving him roughly 2 years to close that gap. Kafelnikov's view, shared on his Hardcourt podcast, was that Djokovic's energy in what remains of his career will increasingly be directed toward winning as many titles as possible at whatever level he can comfortably compete at. ATP 250s, 500s, Masters 1000s, when the surface and conditions suit, rather than grinding through Grand Slam fortnight after Grand Slam fortnight for a result that the physical reality of his age makes increasingly unlikely. And from Kafelnikov's perspective, that is not a diminishment of Djokovic's legacy. It is an intelligent, self-aware player reading his own body and adjusting his ambitions accordingly. The Athens Hellenic Championship in late 2025 was, in this context, more revealing than it appeared on the surface. Djokovic won his 101st career title there, playing 4 matches and beating Lorenzo Musetti in the final. The wins were real, the title was real, but Kafelnikov's observation that even that level of effort, 4 matches against players including a 22-year-old at his physical peak, constituted an enormous burden on a body that has been through 20 years of professional tennis, reframes the result entirely. It was not just a title. It was a data point about what it now costs Djokovic to compete, and about the rate at which those costs are accumulating as his career extends toward its conclusion. The 109 titles target is actually a fascinating subplot to this whole story, because it reframes how you think about the final phase of Djokovic's career if Kafelnikov is right. Connors' record has stood for decades. Nobody has come seriously close to it. Djokovic at 101 is the closest any player in the modern era has got, and the gap of 8 titles is not insurmountable. Not for a player who is still winning tournaments, still capable of beating top 10 players on the right day, and who has stated his intention to compete for at least another 2 seasons. But chasing that record requires a very different calendar strategy from chasing Grand Slams. It means playing more events, playing at levels below Masters 1000 when necessary, targeting weeks where he can be confident of running deep without the kind of physical commitment that a fortnight-long best-of-5 event demands. It means, as Kafelnikov suggested, potentially skipping some Grand Slams entirely in favor of preserving his body for tournaments where the prize, both in titles and in physical cost, makes more sense given the time he has left. The Australian Open 2026 experience illustrated the physical argument more vividly than any statistical analysis could. Djokovic navigated his half of the draw in Melbourne with a significant degree of fortune. 2 of his scheduled opponents either withdrew or retired injured before completing their matches, which meant he arrived at the semifinal against Sinner with considerably less physical expenditure than Sinner had put in. He beat Sinner in 5 sets, snapping a run of defeats against the Italian that had stretched back to late 2023. It was one of his finest performances of the modern era, tactical, precise, physically committed at a level that shocked many observers. But the final, played against Alcaraz 2 days later, told the story that the semi-final had partially concealed. He won the first set convincingly, looked for a period like the old Djokovic, moving smoothly, reading the play early, dictating with his backhand. And then Alcaraz turned it on, and the match turned. And what was left of Djokovic's physical resources from the Sinner semi-final began to show. He lost in 4 sets. Not embarrassingly, but clearly. The 2025 season had already provided the statistical evidence that something fundamental was changing. Before 2025, the last time Djokovic had lost 3 consecutive matches was back in 2018, a 7-year streak of never losing 3 in a row, a period that encapsulated his dominance as completely as any single statistic can. In 2025, it happened twice. His rally tolerance, a technical measure of how effectively he competes in extended exchanges, declined noticeably, and his results on slower courts, where rallies are longer and the physical demands compound, reflected that decline in a way that his results on faster surfaces did not. He was losing in the first round of tournaments he had dominated for years. Too many players had started to believe they could beat him, and that belief, once it exists widely enough across the draw, has its own compound effect on a player's results. The aura of invincibility that had earned him free points deflated opponents before they reached the baseline, and carried him through difficult moments across a career of 20 years had begun to thin. Pat Cash, previewing the tournament ahead of the Melbourne fortnight, identified this precise dynamic as the core problem, not the quality of Alcaraz and Sinner individually, but the requirement to beat them consecutively. He said plainly that he could not see Djokovic defeating both players in back-to-back 5-set matches, and that this was the fundamental obstacle at a Grand Slam in 2026. Cash added that the critical balance for any player towards the end of their career is training hard enough to withstand multiple 5-set matches, while simultaneously not overtraining in a way that depletes them before the tournament even begins. It is a tightrope that Djokovic has been walking with extraordinary skill for years, but the margin for error narrows every season. Tim Henman, speaking similarly in December 2025, agreed that Djokovic could potentially reach another Grand Slam final, but only if someone else in the draw did the work of eliminating one of the top 2. Left to his own devices, having to go through both Alcaraz and Sinner across 2 consecutive matches, the physicality question becomes almost impossible to answer positively. Jack Sock, on his Nothing Major podcast, gave the Australian Open performance its proper credit, while arriving at essentially the same conclusion about the rest of the year. He noted that the Australian Open has been the Grand Slam where Djokovic has historically been most motivated, most comfortable, and most physically attuned. He won 10 of his 24 majors there, which is the most dominant record any player has ever built at a single Grand Slam in the Open era. The crowd in Melbourne, which turned overwhelmingly and emotionally in favor of Djokovic over the final week of the 2026 tournament, gave him energy that was genuinely palpable, and that Djokovic himself acknowledged afterwards was unlike anything he had experienced in years. Sock's point was that if there was one tournament left in Djokovic's career where all the stars could align, the surface, the crowd, the motivation, the draw, the accumulated experience, Roland Garros on clay at 39, grinding through 5 sets per match against players 20 years younger, is a fundamentally different physical proposition. Steve Flink, the Tennis Hall of Fame journalist, offered a perspective on the 25th Grand Slam milestone itself that cuts against the way the narrative has been framed. His view was that the number 25 while historically significant in the context of the men versus women combined rankings, where it would put Djokovic one ahead of Margaret Court, is not actually that meaningful when you separate men's and women's tennis into their proper competitive contexts, as they should be. In that framing, Djokovic at 24 already holds the men's record outright. The 25th would extend it, but it would not fundamentally change his historical standing in the way that the press coverage suggests. The achievement that Flink believes would carry more weight for Djokovic personally is becoming the oldest Grand Slam champion in the Open era, a record currently held by Ken Rosewall, who won the Australian Open at 37 years and 2 months. Djokovic, who won the 2023 US Open at 36 years and 4 months, is already the second oldest Open-era men's champion. One more Grand Slam title, whenever it comes, would put him past Rosewall and into a record that is genuinely, purely his. That motivation, the age record rather than the cumulative tally, may be a quieter but more personally meaningful driver than the pursuit of a number that already sits at the top of the all-time list. It is worth noting in this context what the age record would actually signify beyond the statistic itself. Ken Rosewall was 37 when he won that 1972 Australian Open. The sport in 1972 was physically less demanding, shorter rallies, slower courts, smaller rackets, an overall athletic standard that, while exceptional for its era, was not the same category of physical output that today's Grand Slams require. Djokovic winning a Grand Slam at 38 or beyond would therefore be an even more remarkable achievement than the age comparison suggests. Because the physical environment is categorically more demanding. Modern tennis requires more from the body per point, per game, per set than any previous era in the sport's history. That the record is even in reach for Djokovic at this stage of his career says something about what he has achieved physically that the title count alone fails to capture. What runs through all of these perspectives and what connects them to what Djokovic said himself in that Melbourne press room is the same thread. The real obstacle is not the person across the net. It has never been just about Alcaraz and Sinner. Those two players are exceptional, yes. They are probably the best 1-2 in men's tennis since the peak Federer and Nadal years. But Djokovic, at his best, has handled exceptional players before. He beat Nadal repeatedly on clay, which was supposed to be impossible. He beat Federer at Wimbledon multiple times, which was supposed to be impossible. He has beaten Alcaraz and Sinner across the past 2 years at moments when conditions aligned. The Melbourne semifinal against Sinner proved it. The difference now is not the opponent. It is the cost of getting to them. Every 5-set match at 38 leaves a residue that 48 hours cannot fully erase. The legs recover, the serve loosens up again, but something in the deeper physical reserves, the kind that Djokovic has always drawn on in the 5th set of the biggest matches, the resource that produced those extraordinary Wimbledon comeback victories and those US Open 5th set tiebreaks, takes longer to refill than it once did. This is not decline. This is physics. This is what happens when a human body has been running at elite athletic intensity for over 20 years. Djokovic knows the science of it better than anyone, which is why, when he described the best-of-5 format as the real problem, rather than pointing fingers at the players on the other side of the net, the people in that room who understand the sport were listening carefully. He was not complaining. Every 5-set match takes something from a 38-year-old body that it cannot fully replenish in 48 hours. Every fortnight of a Grand Slam is an accumulation of that cost, not just in the legs and the back, but in the sleep, the nutrition, the nervous system, the immune response. Djokovic knows all of this because he has spent more time studying the science of athletic performance than almost any player in the history of the sport. His dietary discipline, his sleep protocols, his meticulous management of physical load across a season. These are the things that have allowed him to compete at this level until 38 in the first place. But they do not stop the clock. They merely slow it. And in Melbourne, in the final, the clock was audible. He is not done. He said clearly that he intends to keep competing and that the 2028 Los Angeles Olympics is his target retirement event. Whether or not he wins a 25th Grand Slam, the way he goes about the final chapter of his career will be worth watching for reasons that go beyond any particular title. He is the greatest men's player in the history of the sport, by the numbers that matter most. He knows it, his rivals know it. The question of whether one more major follows is interesting, but it was always a secondary story. So what do you think about this? I have one particular question. Do you think Novak Djokovic wins a 25th Grand Slam before he retires?